Welcome to one of the Ragusa Foundation conversation on Italian and international culture. I'm Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the Ragusa Foundation, and today's meeting is entitled, In Other Words, in Altre Parole, Jhumpa Lahiri and Italian Culture. Jhumpa Lahiri needs no presentation. She is one of the best writers in the world, but let me spend at least a few words about her many accomplishments. She's a 2014 recipient of the National Humanities Medal and has won many literary awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, the PEN Hemingway, the PEN Malamud, and the Premio Internazionale Viareggio Versilia, and I'm just mentioning a few of them. After earning a PhD in Renaissance Studies from Boston University, a PhD recently doubled by a doctorate honoris causa of the University of Bologna, she went on to a successful writing and teaching career, and she's currently the director of the creative writing program at Princeton University, one of the most prestigious and internationally minded, I would like to add, creative program in the world. Besides her acclaimed works of fiction, Interpreter of Maladies, The Namesake, Unaccustomed Heart, The Lowland, Dove mi trovo, Whereabouts, she has published the poetry collection Il Quaderno di Nerina, as well as the non-fiction book In Altre Parole, In Other Words, and the translations of three of Domenico Starnone's novels into English, Ties, Trick, and Trust. And as we are speaking of translations, she has a forthcoming book, Translating Myself and Others, and Jhumpa Lahiri graciously sent me an advance copy, and this book is going to be a major part of our conversation. Dear Jhumpa, thank you for being with us today. I truly appreciate it, as I know how busy you are. And I would like to start from the end, and I mean from the forthcoming book, Translating Myself and Others. This is a transformative work, a true key to understand in full your poetics. It is a rich and dense volume that will need a conversation on its own, and therefore I'm inviting you to come back, if you can, just to talk about translational matters. Translating Myself is dedicated to your mother, Tapata Lahiri, called Tia or Ma from you and your sister, a poet and a translator, who passed away, unfortunately, last year, and we were just talking about this a few minutes ago, and please accept, again, my condolences for your still recent loss. All your readers know how important your mother was for you as a person, as a writer, as well as a custodian and promoter of cultural values. It is precisely a childhood memory regarding your mother that opens the book and brings the reader straight into the heart of your poetics. You tell a story when you were 5 and in kindergarten, you were asked to write a card for Mother's Day stating, "Dear Mom, happy Mother's Day." And you struggled as you wanted to insert the Bengali word ma instead of mom. So one of your first writing acts had to do with both writing and translating, as your home language was Bengali and not English. In view of this episode, you go on reflecting that your first book, Interpreter of Maladies, was the result of internalized translations from Bengali into English, as the characters you created and represented were speaking Bengali in your head. This was so much the case that in an essay written after the publication of the book, you concluded, and I quote, "I translate, therefore I am." Your linguistic world was split in two since the beginning, well before you chose Italian as a creative language. Would you please elaborate further on the central aspect of your life and aesthetic universe?
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for your kind words and introduction, and for speaking with me about this book, this new book, which, in some sense, as you say, goes back to the beginning. You know, goes back to the origins of the linguistic confusion and also the linguistic plurality that I've always known. I've never not known it or experienced it, and certainly regarding the act of writing, in particular, that's where I felt the tension, the dilemma. It really did feel like it was a dilemma for me. And honestly, I can't remember what I wrote in the end. You know, I think I've thought about it. I've played it out so many times in my memory that I can't remember what I wrote in the card. I must have written something. I either wrote Ma and felt very badly about it, or I wrote Mom and felt very badly about it, because there was no way to win. I realized that. And I think it was so revelatory. It must have been revelatory for me in my very young, unformed mind and imagination, that this was always going to be a problem. And so I think that over the course of my life and my life as a writer and now as a translator, I think what I've been able to do is to understand and perhaps even appreciate and take advantage of the problem. But the problem doesn't go away. The problem of being conscious of two or even more realities all the time, and being always concerned with somehow disappointing one side or the other, not being true to yourself, all of these sort of rather existential questions, right? That I think many children who were in my position must feel even today. But I think that in my case, these very emotional reactions have, you know, as I say, they haven't resolved, but I think I've worked them into my poetics. I think I've been, I now lean on them. I now turn to these moments of anguish and confusion, as I say, and a central dilemma, and try to, you know, not only accept but to embrace and to create fertile ground from that what seemed like a broken landscape.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jhumpa. Still in your introduction, you closed the introduction of Translating Myself and Others with a beautiful, strong statement, and I would like to read it entirely, a few lines. In fact, you should read it probably, but before I engage seriously with translation, something in my life as a writer was missing. At this point, I can no longer imagine not working on a translation, just as I cannot imagine not working on or thinking of working on my own writing. I think of writing and translating as two aspects of the same activity, two faces of the same coin, or maybe two strokes, exercising distinct but complementary strengths that allow me to swim greater distances and at greater depths through the mysterious element of language. Exploring the mystery of language is something that you had also implied in one of your first video interview in Italian in 2014. Posso scrivere o no? È tutto un po' un mistero, e questo mistero è quello che è importante mantenere in qualche modo. The awareness of writing and translating as mirroring and completing each other seems to have been professionally and personally a fundamental experience. Is the vital connection between translating and writing the key to the mystery of language?
I think so. I think I'm very energized at this point in my life as a writer and translator, to have the double identity, which I've always had, right? I've always had felt torn, two things, then now even three things. In any case, this fundamental key, right, of the hybridity, the notion of being in some sense hybrid, of being a combination of two things, this has now so many declinations, iterations in my, I can think in my life personally and in my, how my work has played out. But I think it's really now that, having crossed over into Italian and then now back again, crossing back again as a translator out of Italian and now actually out of Latin, because I'm working with Ovid, that feels in some sense that has taken me to the final point. That sounds dramatic, but I think to the point where I always wanted to be, or perhaps needed to be. I think wanted is perhaps inaccurate because I didn't realize it until I got there. But now that I'm here in this moment where I'm, yes, I've created a body of work of my own, and I call myself a writer now, and I feel comfortable calling myself a writer, and also the simultaneous activity of translation, and the fact that they aren't very separate activities, and even in my work as a professor, in my pedagogy, I try to promote that idea of how fundamental translation is for all of us, but especially those who want to explore and cultivate their own voice, as it were, their own point of view, their own poetics. I think translation is fundamental, and in fact, I try to at this point in my creative writing courses, I try to put translation really at the forefront, and to ask students to look at language and to look across language, and to constantly be very aware of the infinite and infinitely rich problem of translation. This to me has become incredibly important to explain how to write, how to activate the imagination. And so to really sort of throw back and redefine that idea of translation as being derivative, translation as being, I even hear words like mechanical, automatic. That's not the case at all when we're talking about literature. And I think one of the big revelatory moments I had was when I was putting together the anthology of Italian short stories. And so that was now some years ago. And I really was largely ignorant before putting the book together. I had the impulse to put the book together. I had the impulse to gather together a number of Italian writers who were very important to me, who were inspiring to me for my own writing. And what I discovered in making, putting that book together was how many of them were translators, how many of them were writers who were simultaneously very active as translators from a series of languages. And I felt that I wanted to be one of them. I thought this is how I want to now position myself in terms of my own writing, and in terms of sort of the world of literature and literary activity. It was very important for me to align myself with people, with writer translators like Pavese, like Vittorini, like Annabanti, so many of them who were so active in translation and so active in reading outside of their own language, which is key. And I think this is a problem we have, certainly in the United States, with sort of language departments, collapsing, the rigor of language study being questioned, the translation problem remaining, people being reluctant to teach books in translation, students being reluctant to read in translation, all of these issues, I think, I try to fight against in my new identity I would say, as a writer translator. But as you say from your first question, it's really my original identity, because I was always a writer translator. And I think that's what when I put this new book together and I stepped back, that was what I realized, that, these journeys that we make, these long journeys we make, thinking, oh, now I've arrived at a point where I can now see and understand. We were already there. It's very, I don't know, there's a kind of Borgesian circularity to these things that I find interesting.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you. And thank you for what you said about the languages and the languages department as a professor of Italian studies. Of course, I appreciate that very much. And unfortunately, I feel that also very much. In the passage we discussed before, you use a swimming metaphor. Translating and writing are like two strokes exercising distinct but complementary strengths that allow me to swim greater distances and at a greater depth through the mysterious element of language. You had already used a swimming metaphor as venturing out to a different linguistic and existential shore in your opening chapter, La Traversata, of your first Italian book, in Altre, Parole. There, in 2014, the book was 2015, but the story came out in 2014 on a magazine first. He was swimming in a small lake. Il lago è veramente piccolo, timidly venturing farther and farther from a safe linguistic shore until finally reaching the other. In translating myself and others, 8 years and 2 non-fiction books, a novel, a book of poetry, all in Italian, 3 translations and a self-translation later, is instead a bold determination of swimming greater distances. Granted that no true writer is ever completely happy, and you, right, I've written in many, many places how unhappy you are sometimes with what, all the times with what you finish. So you definitely fall within this category. How far the translation writing connection has taken you and can take you?
I hope as far as I can go. I mean, I think it's an ongoing challenge, and it's an ongoing sense of instability and the attendant risks, right? I mean, I happen to also be a swimmer in real life, not a very talented swimmer, but a dedicated swimmer. And it's that sensation of putting oneself in a new element that we can survive in as human beings. We have the capacity, our bodies have the capacity to learn how to swim and to survive in water. And if you're very skilled, you can survive it, for a long time and cross great distances and cross channels and things. That's certainly not my level as a swimmer, but to use the metaphor, we always realize, even if we're swimming in a small lake, that it's dangerous. We always know that anything can happen. You can have a cramp, whatever. People drown. Things can happen, right? So we do it in it nevertheless, because we love it, because that new element is fundamental in some sense to our well-being, our ability to survive also on dry land, which, shall we say, is our given element, right? As human beings. So I think that this newfound dedication to translating and writing, at the same time, and to sort of move back and forth, and to allow the translation work to then cross-pollinate, to feed into my own imaginative thinking, and to allow my imaginative work and calling to also enable me to translate as best as I can the poetry of, say, Ovid, or the work of Sternone, is to me a real gift. I mean, I feel very energized, as I said, I think, by this dialogue that's happening, and is continuing to happen. And I would feel that a part that a fundamental piece was missing, were I to suddenly set one or the other aside. I think they're fundamentally linked, as I say in the essay at this point. It's a double conversation. It has to be a double conversation.
Thank you. This is, again, a wonderful answer. Thank you. In a revealing essay that you wrote, one of the chapters, so the book about translation, entitled Lingua, one of the most intelligent essay, I have to say right away, that I've ever read on a language, on how a language relates to a speaker. You write that the ongoing phrase that you often hear in Italy, Lahiri scrive nella nostra lingua, even if meant as a compliment, nonetheless means that Italian remains by definition the language of others, as opposed to your own. You also tell about some newspaper interviews in which every time you would state that you're writing in Italian, they would place it in quotation marks as to alert the reader that it was your Italian and therefore not the one of a native speaker. You go on the essay reminding the reader that this is the product of not remembering that a language is a substratum of pre-existing lingue, and you use the Italian, the plural Italian, especially in an Italian speaker. This is really surprising that Italians forget this, right? With the dialects and the pre-existing languages to Latin. In fact, you mentioned that this is why Augustus, according to tradition, could state that all Italy swore alliance to me in my language, mea verba. So the lesson you continue in your essay, as Leopardi remarks in the Zibaldone, is that, and I'm quoting from your book, but is Leopardi speaking, that knowing several languages affords some greater facility and clarity in the way we formulate our thoughts. For it is through language that we think, and perhaps no language has enough words and phrases to express all the infinite subtleties of thought. And you close the chapter commenting these quotations, stating that only if we accept the concept that there is not a comprehensive national language, but lingue, we can express ourselves and know ourselves. Lingue leads us to the infinite within us, to the spaces and the silences, to the sweet sinking into the sea beyond any nation or definition, beyond any hedgerow or border. This is, by the way, one of the best synthetic commentaries to Leopardi's Infinito. We could use these lines that I just read from your book just to explain the Infinito. But the question is accepting translation as part of creative writing a solution to this impasse about lingua?
I hope so. I mean, and I think we can go beyond the creative writing, sort of world as well. I mean, I think we're now, I mean, in that brief essay you mentioned, we can open it up to really talk about political questions of nationhood, questions of identity, all of which again have been throughout my life very vague, very, very disturbing concepts that I never understood how to have a relationship with. I never understood how to have a relationship with the idea of where I came from, who I really was, what was my language, and we know that language is at the heart of identity, at the heart of who we think we are, at the heart of where we think we're from, and I think that these are ongoing questions that I continue to just lightly push back against, and not sometimes a little more acutely, because I think it's important. I think it's important for us to remember, all of us, wherever we're from, whether we're from Italy or the United States or India or wherever we're from, to not lose sight of history, to not lose sight of linguistic history in particular, Because if we stop for a moment and just take in linguistic history, how languages form, how languages come into being, how literature comes into being, how Dante was inspired, right? What he read, how he went across his own borders, shall we say, to find poetry coming from other traditions, and how he himself absorbed and translated, in some sense, other idioms to put into the commedia, and then that then represents the Italian language, you know? And so we lose sight, unless, I mean, not everybody, but the vast majority, you know, loses sight and thinks, oh, this represents the Italian language. And this is, you know, and this is now somehow an airtight structure, but it never is, because language is unstable, always unstable, and language is constantly transforming, as we are transforming, and as you know, in some sense, we can think even geologically, as the earth has transformed, and even the shapes of land masses, all of these things we know have been in ongoing movement and are in continuous movement, now with climactic changes and so forth. Who knows what our coastlines will look like in 100 years, right? So we know these things, and yet it's very easy to cling to the idea, I think, of what is my language, who am I? And I need this point of reference to, in some sense, to survive, to have a sense of myself, to have a sense of my community, to have a sense of who am I as opposed to who are they. And so I understand these impulses, and I think, you know, what's interesting about my experience in Italy, where I'm sensitive, yes, I'm sensitive to, oh, when they put a quotation marks and say, this is my, you know, our language, not your language. I'm sensitive to those things because I love Italian so much, you know, and because I think of the language as being inside of me and a part of me. And so I'm, you know, I do point out, you know, what is this really saying, or how can might this be interpreted? But I also come from an upbringing where there was, in my own childhood, a very specific and ongoing discourse between us and them, and who are we, and who are, you know. So in my childhood, America was them, you know. That's what they do. That's how they, you know, deal with their parents. That's what they do. That's how they celebrate their holidays. That's what, you know. So I realize this is a sort of, you know, universal, if you will, impulse, tendency, things, you know, attitudes people take very much for granted. But then I think there's a whole range of people who are deracinated, who have changed their sort of linguistic, cultural, national, what you will, profile, either because they are forced to or because they wish to. And so that sort of activates you know, a whole other strain, you know, the strain of the migrant, the strain of the hybrid, the strain of those who have moved, whose families have moved from one place to another. I'm teaching a course right now on Primo Levi, on the periodic table, and the magnificent first chapter in that book, which talks about the migration of words, the migration of the mixture and the migration of words from Yiddish, from Hebrew, from dialect, from Spain, from where Levi's family is coming into Italy, and then how all of that then filters, you know, and distills, to use the chemist's word, into Levi's Italian. So inspiring to me, so profoundly inspiring to me to think about an example like that. And so anyway, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but these are things I think we have to talk about, not only through the lens of creative writing and sort of literature, but also more, you know, more broadly, ethically, politically, and what have you. I mean, I just think socially, these are enormous questions that we could talk about now for a long time. We could have a symposium on these questions, I think.
Thank you. No, you answered the question very, very well, actually, embracing all these subjects. And you, in a sense, with the Levi example in particular, the substrata of language, or the many languages, the many lingue that they are behind an author's or anyone's, and language and all the social language carries substance. We know that. So actually, you answered the question very, very well. I appreciate what you said very much. Let's stay on the forthcoming book on translation. I know this was the last thing I read, thanks to you, because you said it to me. And so I, of course, it's stuck on my mind a little bit more than the other stuff that I read before. There is a fundamental chapter which you published as an article last year, and where I find myself is devoted to your self-translation of Dove mi trovo, whereabouts. A chapter that explains such a controversial and suffered decision, that is the decision of self-translating yourself. Initially, you resisted it. Translating other authors from Italian, you state, is a way, and I quote, is a way to maintain contact with the language that I love when I am far away from it. But translating oneself is a different matter. And you pose a question. What surgeon in need of an operation would take the scalpel to herself? Wouldn't she entrust the procedure to another pair of hands? This question seems to pacify the debate, and instead it only opens it up. Because when you read the dozen sample pages that the translator had prepared just to make a decision if translating the book at all, you found, and I quote again, you found that the book had enough sap to sustain another text in another language. And I felt the urge to take over. And you add that it was like when you saw your daughter turning somersaults underwater, and you felt inspired to learn how. Again, the water, you're a swimmer. The lake, here are the somersaults. In a sense, to do that discombobulating act of flipping over was exactly what my book had to do. Because after all, translating means to alter one's linguistic coordinates, to grab on what has slipped away, to cope with exile. These are crucial matters of a poetic of exile. Is self-translating the medicine for the expatriated bilingual or multilingual writer?
I think self-translation is an extreme sport, if you will. And I learned so much from the experience of undergoing it. I don't think it's for every writer, because it really opens up. It's so incredibly potentially turbulent. You know, what can start to happen when one goes back inside of something already produced, already imagined, already conceived. It almost feels unnatural, and it really sort of strikes down lots of sort of the narrative of sort of the creative process and what happens, and, you know, likening it to some kind of, you know, sort of gestation, birth, what have you. This is all, it all has to be redefined, because you essentially have to remake the same thing, which is illogical. When you think about it, and I know writers who have, you know, were known personally or studied writers, read writers who felt very determined to keep doing that. So the example of someone like Beckett, whom I cite, and we know that he was, you know, very dedicated to translating himself out of French and reproducing himself in English. And then there are many writers who really feel that they need to maintain a distance when they migrate into another language. They really need to maintain a distance between that new self, that new linguistic self, and the former or the other self. And at the heart of it is just a generating of selves, of identities, of linguistic identities. And I do think you ask if this is a cure. In some sense, I think this is a cure in general for these broader questions we were talking about just a moment ago about sort of, nationhood and cultural identity and these kinds of things. Not to say that the cure is to erase those things away. I'm not saying that at all, because I think that linguistic and cultural identity have meaning. They have profound meaning for who we are. And it's not that I'm advocating sort of we are all everything, everybody's everybody, we all, it's really how to read the map in a different way, knowing that borders are there, knowing that physical borders exist, knowing that linguistic borders exist, knowing that, things separate us. So many things separate us. But I think the act of self-translation, if someone goes through it, is, the result, at least for me, was an ongoing questioning of who I was in any given language. And to realize that the text is always fluid and can always beget another text and another interpretation and another reading and another iteration. And it's not easy to sit with that, because we like to think of things as definitive. We like to think of things that that serve as that compass, that North Star, that we're not going to be lost because there's our language or our identity or a text, Shakespeare or Dante, or these authors who stand in the firmament. But I think we have to realize that their works too, through translation, have become so many things, so many different things, and there have been so many. There's such elasticity to everything that we think is actually definitive and stable. So that's what I think the deepest revelation for me, in terms of self-translation, not only regarding my own production, nel mio piccolo, but also just in the greater world of how we read things, how we read ourselves, how we read ideas of belonging or not belonging, how we regard canonical texts, which part of the exciting thing about when works do sort of end up, arrive in the canon, shall we say, and are taught and disseminated, is that they're translated. So immediately, I mean, in some sense, the mark of a great work is, how many languages has it been translated in? How many countries, how many people in how many countries have studied the works of Chekhov or Dante or Shakespeare or whomever we're talking about? But then what does that mean? What does that really mean? It's so intimate to translate something into another language. And there's a sort of act of, well, now this word is complicated, but appropriation, right? We have to take possession of that text and absorb it and put it in our own terms, literally in our own terms. But I think this was happening even if we think way back to Ovid's time and Rome and Latin literature and their thirst, their need for Greek literature, Greek traditions, all of this being taken, absorbed, recreated, regenerated to create Latin poetry. This is so exciting. These examples are so important, I think, to always remember. And so self-translation, you know, is I think just a much more acute form of translation out of another language and out of another person's work. But I think self-translation is a sort of, I don't know, I think we need a psychologist maybe in the room to sort of explain what happens really because it's such an interior, things are being shifted on such a deeply interior plane, you know.
And in fact, in self-translating whereabouts, dove mi trovo, you said that you actually went back and edited the Italian text.
I did.
So
did.
now, whenever it will be a second edition or for the paperback edition that wasn't out yet, you actually had some editorial work because of things that you found out of place or not proper because of your self-translation. So what you said, obviously, it's worked. In fact, you mentioned Valerie. Valerie says a book is never really finished. It's and so, but this is true for everything. So thank you. This is a wonderful answer. But very briefly, whereabouts? You say that the translation of the title, if I remember correctly, popped out to your mind when you were on a plane going back to Rome while you were doing already a translation. You were in the United States and you went to Rome for a short time. And when you were on the plane, just close enough to the United States, close enough to New York, I mean, just after taking off, the word whereabouts popped out. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's interesting because you are between two shores, we have two continents, but close enough to the linguistic continent of the translation, the English one, but still, so you were going to Rome, but whereabouts gives the sense of a scattered life. I mean, things cannot be put in a place, in a box, cannot be pinpointed, which is exactly what the book is about, about the protagonist in Dove mi trovo. And by the way, Dove mi trovo can be interpreted as where I am or where am I? So it's also very ambiguous. And we know that it's Rome, but you never mentioned, the protagonist never mentioned that it's in Rome, but we can guess. We know many things that are actually ambiguous. So this translation whereabouts, which is almost untranslatable in Italian, literally, in a sense, is that, how did why were you happy with it?
With whereabouts?
Yes.
I was happy with it. Well, I was happy with it because finally I had something to even, that was even worthy of consideration, in my opinion, the word. And I was happy with it because I felt that it was as untranslatable as Dove mi trovo. So I liked that it was one of these words that was kind of, you know, very, very itself, and very, very, you know, there are words that lend themselves easily, right? And expressions that lend themselves easily into other languages. And then there are other words that are a little more, no, I just prefer to be what I am, you know? And so whereabouts is one of these words that there is no satisfying Italian translation for that either. And I also liked that, like Dove mi trovo, which has this nice ambiguous, as you say, is it an affirmation or is it a question? Whereabouts can also be inflected in English to say, you know, to use it in an interrogative, you know, whereabouts is the local, you know, coffee shop, or as an affirmative. And so I thought that I liked that the two words were talking to each other in these ways, with that, and at the same time remaining very sort of in their own, each in its own linguistic context and sort of root. It's not a Latin root, whereabouts. So I liked that. I liked that they were very different and also very, very, very close. They're very close and very far. So yeah, it was one of those things I think that do happen often when I get on a plane and I know that I'm going back to Rome, and that reality will soon be replacing this one. And so it was rather magical, if I may say. There are things I think I can only still. There are things after 10 years of maintaining a base in Italy and going there as often as I can. It has not yet become predictable to me. It remains a place of intense inspiration and illumination for me. And so, and I know that, I see that, I feel that every time I go back. I feel I'm living and seeing and experiencing the world at an entirely different level. And so much of it is because of Italian and my relationship with the language and my work with the language and my life, my unfolding, ongoing life in the language. So it was, I felt that it was in some sense, that freedom I also feel when I go there to, don't know, I think it just loosens up the mind, the spirit in some way for me. So maybe it was that movement also that allowed that word to come,
Thank you. That was wonderful, by the way. I mean, I don't have any opposition to the fact that you like going back to Rome, because of course, as you know, it's not a city that I dislike. But I have one last, well, 1.5 last questions really, but it's about Ovid. I left it for last because I know that you are translating Ovid, the Metamorphoses, together with a colleague from Princeton, Jelena Baras. And you have already translated some of it, and that, in any case, Ovid pops up over and over since your college years into your work. But in your first Italian book, In Altre Parole, you mention Ovid and your mother together to exemplify the pain of being and feeling in exile, while writing in a language other than the one spoken where we live. And I quote, "I think of Ovid exiled from Rome to a remote place, to a linguistic outpost, surrounded by alien sounds. I think of my mother, who writes poems in Bengali in America, where she cannot find a book written in her language." These are very moving words to read about your mother, of course, especially now, but and Ovid, because we never reflect about these alien sounds surrounding us when we write in a language that doesn't correspond to these sounds, to this reality. One of your favorite metamorphoses that you also use in the book, In Altre Parole, is Apollo and Daphne, which immediately makes us think about Bernini's breathtaking sculpture, of course. The myth naturally has many different levels of interpretations, and we don't have time now to discuss them all. Certainly one of them can be related to gender interpretation, because women may preserve their freedom in almost all Greek mythological myths, and avoid violence, only losing their humanity, becoming either something or someone else in a natural or the animal world, unfortunately. But here I would like to stress the basic literal aspect. Daphne is turning into a laurel tree not to succumb to Apollo's passion. Apollo, repented, transforms the laurel into an evergreen in honor of Daphne. And because Apollo is the protector of lyric poetry, as we know, the laurel is chosen to crown the poets ever since, or at least ever since Petrarch. This metamorphosis tells us about the immortality of poetry, represented by the perennial, by the evergreen laurel, and the mentioning of Ovid and your mother regarding exile and poetry, and their faithfulness to their alien language evokes the soothing, the comforting role of literature, that even in the painful absence of familiar sounds, can flip over, to go back to the somersault, can flip over this pain, because, as you notice, Ovid reminds us that there is no plot without change, the metamorphosis. is this sense of exile that you see, feel, palpate when you long for the language that you have chosen and that is alien in the US? And is your special love for the metamorphosis tied to the fact that the only space we can inhabit as writers is the unsafe, empty, ever-changing space of language?
Yes, I mean, to the second part of your question, you ask it so beautifully. I think that's exactly what we need to embrace as, I mean, now we have this term in our vocabulary, the safe space, right? People think about what is the safe space. I think that is the safe space for a writer, is in fact that space where things are very intensely unstable and shifting. So it's contradictory, you know, it's sort of paradoxical, if you will, idea of what security really means, what to say, you know, but I think that is what the artist has to embrace as the space. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I think that the sense of exile that has been, that I've witnessed from childhood, that I've thought about as a student, reading so many authors, including Ovid, and now my own feeling of, you know, in some sense it's a somersault again. You know, how is it that I, the child of immigrants from India, who has been tracking my whole life, the anguish, the difficulties of being separated from a mother tongue, a homeland, a native city, and so forth. That was my experience of growing up, is witnessing, you know, particularly for my mother, that anguish. It was an anguish for her, and she learned to accept it and to adjust, as most of us do, and we are survivors. We're built to survive, so we survive in all kinds of environments. And so to witness that, and to clearly to be to have been inspired by that in some sense, to write my first works in English. So much of those works were born out of things I observed in my own upbringing and my own, you know, sort of parents' relationship to where they were and where they were not. More importantly, where they were not. And then to strangely, I don't think replicate is the right word, but to recreate on my own terms a situation in which, a very beautiful but peculiar situation, in which I have gone out of my way to insist upon another homeland. That homeland, I myself put it in quotes, I don't know why, because it is it feels, it is a stato d'animo, it's a feeling of home, which is now for me Rome. And I do feel when I'm there that I am home. And even if rationally it feels very, you know, maybe not very convincing, because I didn't grow up there. I still don't live there full time. I go when I can, you know, I go when it's possible. And yet that feeling is there. And so because that feeling persists, because that feeling of groundedness persists for me in Rome, obviously I have the sense of exile now when I'm here in the United States. Perhaps not as acutely as I did in the beginning when I first moved back to the United States after the first 3 years in Rome, but it's still there. It's still part of it. It's not, I never leave Rome and come back here and don't, without suffering. I always suffer. I always suffer in the beginning, and I have to sort of, you know, reset and wait for the next time. And it's very hard to explain because people assume that Rome is the other place and that I am American and that the equation is set in a certain way. And I can say to you, I can say to anybody that that's not the emotional truth. But so there's a kind of exile within the exile, if you will. And I think because part of the pain of exile, as at least what I know from my mother and from much of her poetry, which she would read to me, is the impossibility of explaining really what the condition is. And so therefore we turn to books. We turn to perhaps our own writing. Some people are readers. Some people are readers who then become writers. But I do think I believe in literature. Literature is if I have a religion, it is that. And I believe in literature to constantly be opening up and forcing us to question who we are, forcing us to appreciate and be curious about who the other is, who others are. And I think that is the ultimate act of consolation and of inspiration. For me, at least, that's been my case. And so I try to convey this to my students as well when I can.
Grazie mille Jhumpa, a questo punto perderemo qualche anglofono, pazienza, ma l'ultima domanda la faccio in italiano, così si sente il mio accento romano magari e ti senti meno nostalgico. Ma ecco, volevo chiederti se avevi con te per caso il quaderno di Nerina a portata di mano.
Sì, qui ce l'ho.
Sì, ecco, benissimo.
Eccolo qua.
Ecco, bellissimo. So che stai traducendo con un po' di difficoltà, se ho capito bene, qualcosa hai tradotto ma non tanto, vero? In inglese, parlando di self-translation. Ma volevo chiederti se ci potevi leggere una o due poesie, quello che vuoi, dipende da quanto sono lunghe, dipende da te quanto sei stanca. E prima di quello volevo appunto dire come una cosa che probabilmente è stata, ho visto una conversazione, che è una presentazione del libro su YouTube con Sandro Veronesi e Valerio Magrelli, quindi un narratore più che altro, Veronesi, e ovviamente un poeta, Magrelli. Ovviamente tutte e due scrivono tutto, ma insomma dico, in genere c'era questa. E Veronesi ha detto una cosa che è veramente vera, è impressionante quanto ormai tu conosca, ma non come una studiosa, perché può essere una studiosa che conosce benissimo la letteratura italiana, ma quanto tu veramente sia in dialogo con la tradizione, quindi non la conoscenza della letteratura, ma con la tradizione in italiano. E dico in italiano per non dire la letteratura italiana, per non cadere nel solito errore, perché che appunto la nostra, la vostra, eccetera. Però dico, ed è come Montale, ovviamente, che te stessa citi, ma Montale, Leopardi, Pasolini, Dante, saltino fuori più o meno nascostamente, alcuni in modo molto intertestuale, cioè più nascosto, è più sentito e quindi e spesso umoristicamente nel senso pirandelliano, non parodicamente, ma proprio umoristicamente nel senso pirandelliano, magari rovesciando i termini. Per esempio c'è una poesia verso la costa orientale che non ho mai visto, mi pare che sia il titolo, no? Che non ho mai visto. Ecco, in quella poesia lì, verso la costa orientale che non ho mai visto, a un certo punto fai un riferimento a queste sagome fisse sulla spiaggia, con un mare tenue e ti allontani, cioè la protagonista si allontana dai giunchi affilati. Ecco, quei giunchi affilati, il mare tenue, ovviamente fanno subito pensare al giunco di Dante, al purgatorio, anche perché queste sagome fisse non sanno di essere salve, sembra qui più montaliano che leopardiano questo rapporto con l'infinito. Infatti a un certo punto dice dal loro infinito, appunto queste sagome non sanno, quindi queste citazioni più o meno palesi o più o meno nascoste, Dante, Montale, Leopardi nella stessa poesia, che non è un pasticcio, che non è una costruzione, ma è veramente un dialogo con la tradizione. Quindi questo lo volevo dire proprio perché è impressionante come nel leggere queste poesie sembrano scritte da una persona che è assolutamente è cresciuta dialogando con quella tradizione. Quindi veramente volevo renderti omaggio di questa cosa qui. Ma prego, se tu vorrai leggere qualcosa, ci dici il titolo, io sparisco
allora,
e ti lascio la parola.
Vediamo dov'è quella là. Non c'è. Vediamo un po'. Ecco, lungo la costa orientale. Leggo quella, perché no? Lungo la costa orientale, mai vista, passo in fretta in treno, andando indietro, sempre allontanandomi dai giunchi affilati, dal mare tenue, un po' torbido, e dalla gente in acqua in spiaggia, insieme a qualche macchina posteggiata sulla sabbia. Si gode ciascuno una calda domenica assolata a fine settembre, sagome fisse, a me sembrano davanti a un loro infinito. Sì, questa è una poesia nata così, sì, in treno, in movimento, come tante cose mie. Cioè il treno è fondamentale anche, soprattutto in Italia, fa nascere tante cose. E poi magari leggo questo perché siccome gentilmente hai citato mia madre, abbiamo parlato un po' di lei stamattina, quindi c'è questa qua che parla delle sue poesie e un atto di ritrovamento, ecco qua. Questa è un po' più lunga, ma non è lunga, diciamo una paginetta, 2. Il quaderno in cui mia madre scriveva i suoi versi bengalesi aveva una copertina gialla e abitava accanto al suo letto finché una volta ispirata non lo trovava più. Si ramaricava della sbadataggine. Anch'io sotto sotto non l'ho perdonata. Ci tenevo a sentire quelle poesie in cui capivo 3 parole insieme a tutte le sue viscere. Si è resa al demonio che sposta le nostre cose, come gli pare, ma poi un giorno mi ha chiamata eccitata. È stato mio padre a recuperarlo nello studio sotterraneo, senza neanche cercarlo, scantinato, anticipato, dedicato ai libri respinti. Ah, scusa, scantinato, antipatico, che strano questo errore. Scantinato, antipatico, dedicato ai libri respinti, purgatorio mesto e umido. Lì scendevo sempre con terrore, troppo disordine, troppo passato. Una volta incinta in cerca di chissà cosa ho sbattuto la mano destra contro una scheggia di vetro ed è spuntato l'osso a causa di un contenitore rotto costruito per trasportare una scultura delicata da Calcutta, mai buttato via per pigrizia. Sopra la nocca resta la ferita. In quella colchide mio padre fu un eroe, conquistando un oggetto sacro, superando le prove, atto che declino in quanto affetto. Richiama un po' video anche, no?
Certo,
A questo punto.
Certo. Beh, grazie mille di nuovo, grazie infinite per aver partecipato a questa conversazione. Spero
Grazie
realmente di
Andrea.
poterne fare un'altra presto, perché ci sono tante di quelle cose di cui possiamo parlare.
Molto volentieri.
Grazie,
Magari anche
grazie.
in presenza o a
Anche in
Roma o
presenza,
da
certo.
te.
O a New York o a Roma, certo,
Va va
senz'altro.
bene.
Grazie
Allora, un
mille.
saluto a tutti, grazie a voi, grazie
Grazie
mille.
mille. Ciao. Ciao.